So, I think most of you know that Oxfam is a global movement for change, supporting people against the power of people against poverty around the world. We work on gender justice issues, on climate justice issues, on food justice issues, increasingly on fiscal justice issues, because we understand the critical role that that plays. So before I get into sort of the specifics of what I want to talk about today, I just want to remind each other of the big picture here. Because this actually matters. It's very easy to sort of find yourself thinking this is a nerds conversation among lawyers and accountants and people who are policy wonks. But this actually has a huge impact in the day-to-day lives of people, women and men, girls and boys living in poverty around the planet. It has a huge impact on the priorities and decisions the governments make. It has a huge impact on not only people's ability to thrive, but people's ability to survive. I think many of the people in this room are aware of some research that we did earlier this year as Oxfam, looking at the growing levels of inequality globally, within the North and within the South and between the North and the South. The figure that many of you really stuck in your mind because it was one of those wonderful moments where it was a powerful piece of data was that 85 people on the planet had the same wealth as 3.5 billion people on the planet. Well, that was actually a report that was true when we released it in February, but it's actually now 66 people on the planet who have as much wealth as 3.5 billion people on this planet. We released a second report that, because that was called Working for the Few, that really focused on working for the many, and it talked about the critical role that public services play in alleviating and in fact reversing trends toward growing income inequality on this planet. And it is those very public services, the health and education, water and sanitation, those basic building blocks for prosperity, for stability, that are what we're talking about here when we're talking about the capacity of governments to mobilize their resources to serve the interests of their people. And when we consider this in the broader context, of course, we recognize that there's not just a question of public policy here, there's a question of political will. And that there are forces amassed around the planet who are very much reinforced by the current dynamic. That it doesn't happen by happenstance, it happens because it's in the interests of people of privilege. And so those 85 people and their cronies and friends actually are distorting not only economies but democracies, and creating a dynamic in which the states and the political will of states is significantly undermined in terms of their capacity and their audacity in addressing the deep inequality and injustice that characterize this planet. And that's, of course, fed and exacerbated by a global media that misrepresents the world in which we live, and that talks about Africa, for example, as a sinkhole into which we pour money, rather than recognizing Africa is a pot of gold from which we extract trillions of dollars of wealth in people, and in oil, and in diamonds, and in minerals, and in peanut oil, and in other commodities that sustain our wealth, our privilege, and our inequality in Canada and other countries in the North. So it's within that context that we need to then delve down into the nitty-gritty of these policies and practices and processes, because, as I say, it's very easy to lose sight of what's really at stake here. And the courageous women and men, courageous and creative women and men around the world who are on the front lines of this struggle. We released a report a couple months ago called Business Among Friends that really tries to look at, as the subtitle says, why corporate tax dodgers are not yet losing any sleep over global tax reform processes, right? And it unpacks some of the reality of this BEPS process and various other processes that we've been talking about today. Looking at the, as I say, that ingrained privilege and the ingrained power dynamics that actually thwart our capacity to make significant progress, significant reform in these spaces. If we look at how much money is being lost to governments, I mean, for a government such as the government of Bangladesh, the amount of money that is seeping out of that country is equivalent to, sort of 20%, 25% of their education budget for the whole country. In a country like Peru, they could fund their entire maternal health and newborn health programs with the sort of money that is seeping through their hands because of tax shifting, because of tax incentives. And as I say, this has a huge, huge impact. And it is sustained because of, as I say, the complicity and complacency of politicians in the North. And the processes that the OECD and others are creating really are not fundamentally addressing those power dynamics. So who has power and how they're using or abusing their power continues to be relatively unchallenged. And those of us who have less power, our ability to recognize that power, mobilize that power, and accelerate that power is hampered by what's happening under these sort of rigged rules and behind these closed doors. If we look, for example, at this most recent round around the BEPS, there were 135 submissions that were sent into the OECD. 87% of those submissions were made by corporations. Of the 135, there were only 5 from developing countries, right? More than 40% of them came from, the US and the UK, the usual suspects. And, what they're doing, of course, is mounting this global chorus. There were only 2 of those corporate voices that supported the reform program. On the contrary, the other 100 plus, the lawyers and the lobbyists who are working for those corporations were united in their chorus that the status quo serves us well, and any change to the status quo threatens the global economy. Right? And so all of a sudden, then submissions that were being put forward by the OECD that spoke to country by country reporting, they get shelved. And then, of course, surprise, surprise, KPMG puts out a report announcing that's good news. Well, of course it's good news if you're KPMG. But what does it mean for, as I say, those women and men, girls and boys living in poverty? It means that the urgency that they feel for action is yet again set aside. Oh, okay, maybe the next round. We didn't do it this time, but we'll get around to it when we get our act together. Not good enough. When we look at who are the major actors in this, the countries that are leading the discussion around intellectual property, well, it's the Americans and the French, right? So where does Zambia fit into that conversation? Where does Afghanistan fit into the conversation? And in that dynamic, then we see that we've got the G20, which are some southern economies, developing economies, but obviously the most robust among them, and the traditional nations that monopolize power and monopolize debate around how we will transform or reform any of that power. Who are really framing all the questions, framing the processes, and prejudging the outcomes, right? So in that dynamic, then, the capacity of countries in the South to actually reframe what is actually at stake here, what are the questions and what are the solutions, are very much thwarted. And Samuel spoke to that earlier today. Other speakers are speaking to the frustration of the South as they're trying to get into this conversation and have some impact on it. What we find is that the calculation we've done is that if the countries in sub-Saharan Africa had as many tax officials as your average OECD country, there would be 650,000 more tax collectors and inspectors and regulators in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So their ability to come to the table with propositions, with insights, with regulations, is severely undermined, and there's no global recognition of how we need to support and privilege those voices in order that we get out of the box that we find ourselves in. If we're going to do that, we need to recognize, as I say, the power of the corporations and recognize the power of the northern governments. I spent a lot of time in another space, the Global Partnership on Effective Development Cooperation, and I'm always struck there because everyone's talking about the private sector as being the road and the avenue and the lever for development all of a sudden. And I'm always struck how few people from the private sector even show up at those fora in Busan and in Mexico City. And of course I realize they don't need to, because ministers show up. And ministers very, very ably and effectively represent the interests of those private corporations. So why would they take time from their cigars and their lunches to show up to that forum? Because their interests are already being well represented by our governments in those spaces. And so, as I say, if we don't fundamentally rethink and reframe those conversations and acknowledge that 4/5 of the countries are effectively marginalized and excluded from those conversations, then we're not going to have any substantive difference in terms of the outcome of those conversations. When we look at what are the issues that are of priority to southern countries, they're issues related to agribusiness, and there are issues related to extractives, and there are issues related to telecommunications. They're barely on the agenda of a lot of these conversations because that's not the priority if you're in the EU or if you're in the US. And so, we need to develop a new system and a new conversation here that really puts non-G20 and non-OECD countries in a privileged position. We need to create a global body that is actually going to be improving tax governance globally and acknowledging that incremental action in the various spaces may have some value, but actually until we have some coherent global structure and understanding of that fundamental social contract whereby we as citizens and as human beings have rights and states have obligations to create the conditions to allow us to exercise those rights, and it is through the resources that they mobilize, through taxes or royalties, that they can actually fund that is actually fundamental, and we need to take those on. And in the short term and in the interim term, yes, we do need to take advantage of the spaces we have. So in the BEPS, we need to be ensuring that all governments are putting an end to the race to the bottom. We need to ensure that all governments are taxing wealth where it's created. We need to ensure that all governments are supporting taxation as something that is mutually understood and mutually reinforcing. As bleak as the picture is, I just want to remind ourselves that there are lots of groups that are taking on these battles and making progress on these battles. Many of us were buoyed in recent weeks by the victories in Niger, where Areva, the French nuclear corporation, was in this obscene relationship with the government of Niger, whereby it paid a corporate tax rate that was in the 5.5% range, where it had an exemption from the VAT. That in itself would have generated enough income to pay for 200,000 students in Niger to get through their primary education. And it had a guaranteed stability of its tax regime to the year 2048. And so, when we talk about negotiating to advantage with these southern countries, it was a clear abuse of power. And in the end, the courageous work of civil society organizations in Niger, with support from Oxfam and other allies around the world, were able to put pressure on the government of Niger, but also the government of France and Areva, to agree that it had to renegotiate its arrangement. It had to give up its exemption. It had to negotiate up to 12%. Ooh, 12%, that's scary. Everyone else is paying 35%, but ooh, 12% for their taxes. And they were spurred on in part by a campaign, a very clever campaign, I thought, in France, that was encouraging citizens to go out and negotiate their taxes. Just find a government official and just sit down and negotiate your taxes with them. That's what the corporations do. If they can do it, why can't we? So it is that sort of audacity, that sort of creativity, but that sort of tenacity that we need, and if we do that collectively together, we will